Somewhere in a mansion filled with marble floors and crystal chandeliers, a 19-year-old girl was about to do something no one in that house thought she was capable of doing. Something that would bring a billion-dollar empire to its knees in front of the very people who had spent years looking straight through her. But to understand how she got there, you have to go back to where it all began, a small room below the stairs, where nobody ever thought to look for greatness. Tessa Shaw had grown up in the basement of the Ashford estate, a sprawling property so large that its west wing alone was bigger than the entire house she might have lived in if her mother's life had gone differently. Her mother, Rosa, had worked as the estate's head housekeeper for almost 2 decades, polishing floors she would never be invited to walk across barefoot, cooking meals she would never be asked to share at the table. Tessa had inherited that same quiet invisibility. She had learned from a very young age that in this world there were 2 kinds of people, those who were seen and those who served. The Ashford family did not go out of their way to be cruel. That was almost the worst part. They simply forgot she existed, the way a person forgets the wallpaper in a room they have walked through 1,000 times. Richard Ashford, the family patriarch and CEO of Ashford Global Holdings, would occasionally nod at Tessa if their paths crossed in a hallway, and his son, Cole, treated her the way he treated the furniture, useful, expected to stay in its place, and never worth a second glance. But underestimating a person is a dangerous thing, because it means you stop watching them. And when no one is watching you, you can do extraordinary things in the dark. By the time she was 12, Tessa had already read every book in the modest local library twice. By 14, she had taught herself French using discarded textbooks she found in a donation box behind Cole's old private school. By 16, she had added Mandarin, German, and Spanish to her secret arsenal, practicing pronunciation under her blanket with an old cassette recorder she'd bought for $2 at a garage sale. By 18, she had mastered Arabic and Russian as well. 7 languages in total, each one a private rebellion against the life everyone assumed she was destined for. She kept her notebooks hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her bed, filled with vocabulary lists, grammar notes, and translated newspaper clippings. She never told anyone, not her mother, who worked 80-hour weeks and came home too exhausted to notice anything beyond the ache in her own back. Not the other staff, who might have gossiped, and certainly not the Ashfords, who Tessa had learned, through years of quiet observation, respected only the things they could put a price tag on. "Why do you do it?" her mother asked her once, catching her at 2 in the morning with a Russian grammar book open beneath a flashlight. "Because someday," Tessa whispered, "somebody underestimating me is going to be a mistake." She didn't know, back then, just how true those words would become. She didn't know that in a few short years, all those hours of hidden study, the aching eyes, the sleepless nights, the whispered verb conjugations recited into a pillow so no one would hear, would come together in a single, electrifying moment inside a boardroom filled with the most powerful people she had ever served coffee to. She didn't know that the very people who had never once asked her name correctly were about to owe her everything. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind that gives no warning of the storm it's about to unleash. Ashford Global Holdings was preparing to close the largest deal in the company's 60-year history, a $500 million investment partnership with a group of international financiers who had flown in from overseas for what everyone believed would be a routine, celebratory signing. Tessa had been asked, ordered really, to help serve refreshments during the final negotiation meeting, since half the household staff had called in sick that week. She wasn't given a reason to think this day would be any different from the thousands of quiet, invisible days that had come before it. She straightened her plain black uniform, picked up a silver tray lined with porcelain cups, and walked into the boardroom without anyone in that room realizing she could understand every single word about to be spoken in a language they assumed was theirs alone. What happened next would change the fate of a company worth billions of dollars, and would prove, in front of the entire world, that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the only one paying attention. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when powerful people believe they cannot be understood, a careless, arrogant silence, the kind that makes men speak freely about things they would never say in front of witnesses. Tessa Shaw was about to become the witness they never accounted for. The boardroom on the top floor of Ashford Tower was designed to intimidate, Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. A table of imported walnuts stretched nearly the length of the room, and at its head sat Richard Ashford, flanked by his son Cole and a small army of lawyers in identical charcoal suits. Across from them sat the visiting delegation, a group of wealthy investors led by a soft-spoken but sharp-eyed man named Faisal Al-Rashid, representing a consortium that called itself the Meridian Capital Group. On paper, the deal was simple. Meridian would inject $500 million into Ashford Global Holdings in exchange for a minority equity stake, allowing the Ashford family to expand into new international markets while retaining full control of the company Richard's grandfather had built from nothing. That, at least, was a story everyone in the room believed. Tessa moved along the edges of the table, refilling water glasses, setting down cups of coffee with practiced, silent precision. No one looked at her. No one ever did. To the men in that room, she was as unremarkable as the carpet beneath their feet. It was during a short recess, while the American lawyer stepped out to review a final clause, that the investors began speaking quietly among themselves, in Arabic, believing themselves completely alone in a room occupied only by the help. Tessa froze mid-pour, her pulse suddenly hammering in her ears. Once the secondary agreement is triggered, one of the men murmured, glancing briefly toward the door, the voting shares transfer automatically. Ashford won't even realize he signed away control until it's far too late to reverse it. Another man chuckled low in his throat. He thinks he's gaining a partner. He has no idea he's handing us the company. Tessa's hands trembled so slightly that no one noticed, but inside, her mind was racing at the speed of a woman who had spent years preparing, without ever knowing why, for exactly this moment. She understood every word. Buried somewhere inside the 500-page contract was a clause, likely disguised in dense legal and financial language, that would silently convert the minority stake into majority. Voting control the moment a specific and probably obscure trigger condition was met. It was a trap, a carefully engineered, meticulously hidden trap, designed to strip Richard Ashford of the company his family had spent 60 years building, and hand it over to men who had smiled at him through an entire week of negotiations. She wanted to scream. She wanted to slam the tray down and shout the truth across the table. But she forced herself to breathe, to keep pouring water with a perfectly steady hand, to keep her face blank and unreadable, the way she had trained herself to do since childhood. If they suspected for even a moment that the quiet girl with the coffee tray understood their language, the conversation would stop, the evidence would vanish, and any chance of stopping them would disappear with it. So she listened. She memorized names, phrases, section numbers they mentioned in passing. Clause 14, subsection C, was repeated twice, and the moment she finished refilling the last water glass, she excused herself from the room with her tray, her heart pounding so hard she was certain someone would hear it. She had maybe 6 hours before the final signing ceremony was scheduled to begin. 6 hours to convince someone, anyone, that a maid's daughter had just uncovered a $500 million conspiracy hiding in plain sight. She made her way straight to Richard Ashford's private office, rehearsing the words in her mind, praying that for once in her life, someone would actually listen to her. She had no idea that the first person she would find behind that door wasn't Richard at all. It was his son, Cole, and he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Cole Ashford was the kind of man who had never once, in 28 years of life, needed to be doubted. He had grown up believing that confidence and competence were the same thing, that a name like Ashford opened every door that mattered, and that people who worked with their hands existed in an entirely different category from people who worked with their minds. So when the housekeeper's daughter burst into his father's office, out of breath and insisting she needed to speak with the CEO immediately about the Meridian deal, Cole didn't feel alarm. He felt annoyance. "Tessa, right?" he said, not bothering to look up from his phone at first. The casual cruelty of not quite remembering a name doing more damage than an insult ever could. "This isn't a great time. We're an hour from signing the biggest deal this company has ever done." "That's exactly why I need to talk to your father," Tessa said, her voice steadier than she felt. "There's something wrong with the contract. A hidden clause. I heard the investors talking about it. In Arabic, they think no one understood them." For a moment, Cole simply stared at her, and then he laughed. Not cruelly at first, almost in disbelief, the way a person laughs when they think they've misheard something absurd. "You speak Arabic," he repeated flatly. I speak 7 languages, Tessa said. I heard them say the deal has a secondary agreement buried in it. Clause 14, subsection C. Once it triggers, their minority stake automatically converts to majority voting control. They're planning to take the company, not invest in it. Cole set his phone down slowly, and for just a heartbeat, something flickered behind his eyes, the faintest shadow of uncertainty. But pride is a powerful thing, especially in a man who has never had to question himself, and pride won. Let me get this straight, he said, standing up now, his voice sharpening into the tone he used with employees he considered beneath serious conversation. You clean rooms in this building. You've never sat in a single negotiation, never read a page of that 500-page contract, never taken a single business or law class in your life. And you expect me to believe that you, of all people, caught something that a team of Harvard-trained lawyers, forensic accountants, and my father's own advisors missed? I'm not asking you to believe it because of who I am, Tessa said, holding his gaze despite the heat rising in her chest. I'm asking you to check it. That's all. Just look at Clause 14, subsection C, before anyone signs anything. You know what I think? Cole said, stepping closer, his voice dropping into something colder and more dismissive. I think you saw an opportunity to make yourself feel important. Maybe you overheard a few words you didn't understand and built some fantasy around it. This is a $500 million transaction, not a soap opera. Go back to whatever you were doing before you decided to barge in here. Please, Tessa said, and for the first time her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the exhausting weight of being disbelieved her entire life. Just 5 minutes with your father. That's all I'm asking. My father does not have 5 minutes of the housekeeper's daughter's conspiracy theories, Cole snapped, and something in his tone made it clear the conversation, as far as he was concerned, was already over. Do yourself a favor and don't repeat this to anyone else in this building. It won't make you look clever. It'll make you look delusional. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an actual deal to finish. He walked past her, out the door, without so much as a backward glance, leaving Tessa standing alone in the empty office, humiliation burning hot behind her eyes. For one long, terrible moment, she almost gave up. She almost believed the version of herself that Cole had just described. Foolish, delusional, a maid's daughter who didn't understand her place. Years of being overlooked had trained a small, quiet part of her to accept that maybe this was simply how the world worked, and that people like her weren't meant to be believed. But then she thought of her notebooks hidden beneath the floorboard. She thought of every night she had fallen asleep with a foreign dictionary pressed against her chest, teaching herself something no one had ever asked her to learn, simply because some part of her had always known that knowledge, real knowledge, doesn't ask permission to matter. She wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and made a decision that would change everything. If no one would listen to her, she would make sure they had no choice but to. She had less than 5 hours left, and she was about to do something far riskier than simply speaking up. She was about to gather proof. Fear, Tessa realized as she hurried down the marble staircase toward the lower conference rooms, has a strange way of sharpening the mind instead of dulling it. Every instinct told her to give up, to accept Cole's humiliating dismissal and return to her invisible place in the background of other people's important lives. But somewhere beneath that fear was something stronger, a quiet, burning certainty that she was right, and that being right mattered more than being believed, at least for now. If she couldn't convince anyone with words alone, she would need something undeniable, evidence. She remembered that the investors, along with Richard Ashford's team, had reconvened for a final pre-signing discussion in the smaller East Conference room down the hall from the kitchen, a room she had served coffee in dozens of times before, invisible and unnoticed, exactly the way she needed to be now. She retrieved her phone from her locker, hands still trembling slightly, and set to record audio before slipping it into the pocket of her apron. She re-entered the room carrying a fresh tray of coffee, her heartbeat pounding so loudly she was certain it would give her away. No one looked up. No one ever did. For the next 40 minutes, as lawyers debated final wording changes and Richard Ashford chatted amiably with Faisal Al-Rashid about vineyards in Napa Valley, the investors occasionally slipped back into hushed Arabic conversation among themselves, confident in their secrecy, unaware that every word was being captured and understood in real time by the young woman refilling their water glasses. Tessa learned more with each passing minute. The trigger condition for the hidden clause, she discovered, was tied to a seemingly harmless benchmark buried deep in the financial appendix, a stock performance metric that Meridian's own analysts had quietly ensured would be met within 90 days of signing, thanks to trades Meridian itself planned to make immediately after the deal closed. It wasn't just a hidden clause. It was an elaborately engineered trap, guaranteed to spring almost as soon as the ink dried. Once she had what she needed, she excused herself and hurried to an empty stairwell, pulling out her phone with shaking hands to review the recording, translating key portions into English in a rushed, urgent voice memo of her own, cross-referencing everything against a digital copy of the contract she managed to access through the shared company drive using her mother's basic clerical login, a login nobody had ever bothered to restrict, because nobody had ever imagined the housekeepers. Daughter would need it for something like this. 3 hours remained. She needed someone with actual power to listen to her, someone who wouldn't laugh her out of the room the way Cole had. She thought carefully through everyone she'd overheard mentioned in the negotiations, and one name surfaced in her memory. Diane Whitfield, a longtime member of Ashford Global's board of directors, known throughout the company as sharp, skeptical, and famously difficult to fool. Diane had a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions in meetings, for trusting numbers over charm, and for having personally opposed rushing the Meridian deal from the very beginning. Tessa found Diane's office on the 14th floor, took a single steadying breath outside the door, and knocked. "I don't have much time, and neither do you," Tessa said the moment the door opened, before Diane could even ask who she was. "But I have proof that this deal is going to hand control of this company to Meridian Capital, and I need 5 minutes to show you why." Diane Whitfield studied the young woman standing in front of her. Uniform, shaking hands, eyes red from crying but burning with an intensity that made Diane pause before dismissing her outright. Something about the girl's certainty, the specificity of her claim, the audio recording already pulled up and ready on her phone, made Diane hesitate in a way she rarely did. "Who are you?" Diane asked slowly. "And how do you know Arabic well enough to have understood a private conversation between international financiers?" "My name is Tessa Shaw," she said. "I clean rooms in this building, and I taught myself 7 languages because everyone in my life told me I'd never need them for anything that mattered." Diane Whitfield looked at her for a long moment, then glanced at the clock on her office wall. 90 minutes remained before the signing ceremony was scheduled to begin. "Play me the recording," Diane said finally, "and you'd better be right, because if you are, we don't have a second to waste." There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room the moment someone realizes they've been deceived, a silence heavier than any argument, more devastating than any accusation. That silence was about to fill the grand signing hall of Ashford Global Holdings, and would begin with the voice of a girl no one in that room had ever bothered to truly see. Diane Whitfield had listened to less than 2 minutes of Tessa's recording before her expression shifted from polite skepticism to genuine alarm. She pulled up the contract on her laptop, cross-referencing Clause 14. Subsection, see exactly as Tessa described it, her sharp eyes scanning line after line of dense legal language until she found it, buried beneath layers of financial jargon designed specifically to discourage careful reading. A performance-triggered voting conversion clause, activated by a stock benchmark, the internal Meridian trading patterns, visible in the appendix if you knew exactly where to look, all but guaranteed would be hit within 3 months. "My God," Diane whispered, "this is an investment. It's a hostile takeover disguised as a partnership." There was no time for a quiet, careful escalation through proper channels. The signing ceremony was set to begin in less than an hour, and Richard Ashford, along with half the executive board, a small legion of lawyers, and several financial journalists invited to cover what was being billed as a historic deal, was already gathering in the grand hall downstairs. Diane grabbed her laptop, grabbed Tessa by the arm, and together they moved as quickly as decorum allowed to the marble corridors of Ashford Tower, the enormity of what they were about to do settling over both of them with every step. They arrived just as Richard Ashford was rising to give his opening remarks, champagne glasses already being distributed among the assembled crowd, camera flashes beginning to flicker from the small press pool near the back of the room. "Richard, stop," Diane called out, her voice cutting sharply across the celebratory murmur of the hall. "Do not sign that contract." The room fell into confused silence. Richard Ashford turned, visibly startled, while Cole shot Tessa a look of pure disbelief and rising fury. "Diane, what is the meaning of this?" Richard asked, glancing nervously toward the Meridian delegation, who had gone very still and very quiet near the front of the room. "This deal is a trap," Diane said. "Clause 14, subsection C, converts your family's controlling stake to Meridian the moment a specific stock benchmark is hit. A benchmark their own trading activity is designed to trigger within 90 days of signing. You would be handing them the company, not partnering with them." "That's absurd." One of the Meridian lawyers interjected quickly. "This board member is clearly confused about standard investment terminology." "I'm not confused," Diane said evenly, "because I'm not the one who discovered this. She is." All eyes turned to Tessa, standing quietly at the edge of the room in her plain uniform, the same uniform that had made her invisible to every powerful person in that building for years. "This is ridiculous," Cole said, his voice rising with fury and embarrassment in equal measure. "This is the same nonsense she tried to feed me an hour ago. She's a housekeeper's daughter. For God's sake. She doesn't understand contracts. She doesn't understand finance. And she certainly doesn't." "I understand Arabic," Tessa said quietly, and something in her calm, steady voice cut through the room more effectively than any shout could have. "I heard your investment partners discussing this exact clause in a language they assumed no one in this building could understand. I have it recorded. I have it translated. And I have it cross-referenced against the exact page and paragraph in your contract." She looked directly at Faisal al-Rashid, whose composed expression had begun, almost imperceptibly, to crack. "Would you like me to play it?" Tessa asked. "Or would you like to explain to everyone in this room yourselves what Clause 14 actually does?" The silence that followed was absolute. Every journalist in the room leaned forward. Every lawyer reached for their copy of the contract. And Richard Ashford, the man who had built an empire and was seconds away from unknowingly signing it away, turned to look at the quiet young woman who served him coffee every week, seeing her, truly seeing her, for the very first time in his life. "Play it," he said. Tessa's hands were steady now, steadier than they had been all day, as she pressed play on the recording in front of the entire assembled hall. The Arabic voices filled the room, calm, confident, utterly convinced of their own secrecy. And one by one, as Tessa translated each sentence aloud in real time, word for word, the color drained from the faces of the Meridian delegation. "Once the secondary agreement is triggered, the voting shares transfer automatically," Tessa translated, her voice ringing clear and unwavering across the silent hall. "He thinks he's gaining a partner. He has no idea he's handing us the company." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Camera flashes exploded from the press pool as journalists scrambled to capture the moment. Richard Ashford stood frozen at the head of the table, staring at the contract in his hands. The contract he had been seconds away from signing, as the full weight of what had almost happened settled over him. Faisal al-Rashid attempted, briefly, to argue that the recording had been taken out of context, that the translation was flawed, that this was some kind of misunderstanding. But Diane Whitfield had already pulled up Clause 14, subsection C, on the large presentation screen for the entire room to see, walking the board and the lawyers line by line through the exact mechanism Tessa had described. The hidden trigger, the conveniently guaranteed stock benchmark, the automatic inversion of voting control. The evidence, once illuminated, was impossible to dispute. Within minutes, Ashford's own legal team confirmed what Tessa had uncovered entirely on her own, using nothing but her hidden gift for languages and the sheer refusal to stay silent when it mattered most. The deal was dead on the spot. Security quietly escorted the Meridian delegation from the building as journalists shouted questions and lawyers scrambled to draft emergency statements. Within days, financial regulators had opened an investigation into the consortium's dealings, and the story of the scheme's collapse began appearing in headlines around the world. But the story that truly captured the public's imagination wasn't about the failed takeover at all. It was about the housekeeper's daughter who had quietly taught herself 7 languages in secret, who had been mocked and dismissed by a room full of powerful men, and who had saved a billion-dollar company using nothing but her mind and her courage. Richard Ashford, humbled and deeply grateful, personally thanked Tessa in front of the entire board, offering her not just his gratitude, but a full scholarship to study international affairs at any university she chose, along with a standing position within the company's international relations division. Cole Ashford, forced to confront the humiliating truth of his own arrogance in front of cameras and colleagues alike, offered Tessa a quiet, genuine apology weeks later. One she accepted graciously, without ever needing to gloat. News outlets picked up her story within days. The maid's daughter who speaks 7 languages and saved a billion-dollar empire. One headline read, interview requests poured in. Letters arrived from young people around the world. Daughters of housekeepers, sons of janitors, children who'd been told, in ways large and small, that they would never amount to anything beyond the role society had assigned them. Tessa answered as many as she could personally, telling each of them the same thing she had once whispered to herself in the dark, beneath a blanket, with a flashlight and a foreign grammar book. Nobody's opinion of your potential is the final word on it, she told one interviewer, sitting in a chair she once would have polished rather than sat in. I spent years being told I would never belong in rooms like this. I believed, quietly, that knowledge doesn't ask for permission to matter. It simply waits for its moment. Tessa went on to study international affairs, eventually working in diplomatic and corporate advisory roles where her extraordinary gift for languages, once hidden beneath a floorboard in a basement bedroom, became one of the most valued skills in the room. She never forgot where she came from, and she never forgot the lesson her own life had taught her, one she carried with her for the rest of her career. The people the world overlooks are so often the ones quietly building the very skills that will one day change everything. Genius doesn't always announce itself with wealth, status, or a powerful last name. Sometimes it grows in silence, in a basement bedroom, under a blanket, by flashlight, waiting patiently for the one moment when it will finally, unmistakably, be impossible to ignore. And when that moment came for Tessa Shaw, she did not waste it.